This documentary is presented with the utmost respect for the victims, survivors and their families. The events discussed are real, deeply tragic and remain a painful part of British history. Our purpose is not to sensationalise violence, but to examine how one of the most notorious criminals in the United Kingdom was able to evade capture for so long, and how he ultimately ended up inside Broadmoor Hospital. Welcome to episode 1 of our Broadmoor Hospital series. If you're interested in the stories behind some of the most infamous patients ever held inside Britain's high-security psychiatric hospitals, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this series will explore crimes, investigations, trials, and psychological questions surrounding these cases in depth. And there is perhaps no more infamous place to begin with than with the man the world came to know as the Yorkshire Ripper. Part 1. In the autumn of 1975, fear began to spread across the streets of northern England. Women walking home alone glanced over their shoulders. Taxi drivers became suspicious of lone passengers. Police forces across Yorkshire were receiving reports of brutal attacks that, at first, did not seem connected. But behind the headlines, a pattern was already emerging. The attacker approached from behind. He carried a hammer, and he showed a level of violence that shocked even experienced detectives. His name was Peter Sutcliffe. He was born on 2nd of June 1946 in Shipley. To neighbours, he appeared ordinary. He came from a working class family, held various jobs, married his wife, Sonia, in 1974, and eventually worked as a lorry driver. Nothing about his outward appearance suggested that he would become one of Britain's most feared serial killers. Yet those who later examined his early life found disturbing signs. His father was reportedly violent and abusive. Sutcliffe grew up in a household marked by conflict, humiliation and fear. As a teenager, he developed an obsession with watching prostitutes and their clients, spending hours lurking around the red light district in Leeds and Bradford. In 1969, he carried out his first known attack. A prostitute was struck on the head with a stone wrapped in a sock. Police visited his home after the victim noted a vehicle registration number connected to him, but no charges were pursued. It was a missed opportunity, the first of many. By 1975, the violence had escalated dramatically. On the night of July 5th, 36-year-old Anna was attacked in Keighley. She was struck unconscious with a hammer and slashed with a knife. She survived, but the psychological scars remained for years. Just weeks later, another woman, Olive Smelt, was attacked in Halifax. The method was chillingly similar. A brief conversation, a sudden blow from behind, then mutilation. Again, the victim survived. Again, crucial clues were overlooked. Neither woman was a prostitute, and investigators failed to recognise the significance of that fact. Then, an attacker targeted a 14-year-old schoolgirl named Tracy Brown. She was walking along a country lane when she was struck repeatedly with a hammer. Only the approach of a passing car caused the attacker to flee. The girl survived after emergency brain surgery. On October 30th, 1975, the violence crossed a horrifying threshold. Wilma McCann left her home that evening and never returned. She was attacked from behind with a hammer. The injuries were catastrophic. Her body was discovered near playing fields in the Chapeltown area of Leeds. What police did not yet realise was that this was only the beginning. Over the next 5 years, the man responsible would murder repeatedly, terrorise entire communities, and become the subject of one of the largest manhunts in British history. And despite interviewing him multiple times, police would still fail to stop him. Part 2. By the beginning of 1976, West Yorkshire Police were facing a terrifying reality. The murder of Wilma McCann was no longer being treated as an isolated attack. Detectives were beginning to suspect that a serial offender was operating across Yorkshire, but they still had no name, no clear suspect, no idea of how close they already were to the killer. On January 20th, 1976, 42-year-old Emily Jackson was found brutally murdered in Leeds. She had been struck with a hammer, dragged into a deserted yard, and stabbed dozens of times with a sharpened screwdriver. The attack showed an escalation in both violence and confidence. Forensic evidence revealed a boot print near the body. It was one of the several clues that would later point towards Peter Sutcliffe. Months later, another woman, Marcella Claxton, accepted a lift from a stranger after a party. When she stepped out of the car, she was struck from behind with a hammer. Claxton survived and later testified against Sutcliffe. At the time of the attack, she was 4 months pregnant. She lost her baby. By 1977, killings were becoming front-page news across Britain. Women changed their routines. Friends walked each other home. Taxi drivers were warned to be vigilant. In Leeds and Bradford, fear became part of everyday life. On 5th of February, prostitute Irene Richardson was murdered in Ronday Park. Her body had been arranged after death in a disturbing display that suggested the killer was becoming increasingly ritualistic. Then came April. Patricia Atkinson, known as Tina, was murdered in her own flat in Bradford. Police discovered another boot print. Again, the clue went nowhere, but the case that changed everything came only 2 months later. On the night of June 25th, 1977, 16-year-old Jane MacDonald missed her bus home after a night out with friends. She decided to walk. She never made it. Her body was discovered the following morning in a playground in Chapeltown. Until that moment, many people had believed the killer targeted only prostitutes. Jane MacDonald shattered that assumption. She was a teenager with no connection to the sex trade. Her murder transformed public fear into panic. Newspapers demanded action, politicians demanded answers, and police launched one of the largest investigations in British criminal history. Later that year, another victim, Jean Jordan, was murdered in Manchester. Among her belongings was a newly issued £5 note. Detectives traced it through bank records and narrowed the inquiry to thousands of possible recipients. One of the men interviewed was Peter Sutcliffe. He was questioned, his alibi appeared credible, and he was eliminated from the inquiry. For investigators, it seemed like another dead end. For Sutcliffe, it was another escape. In December 1977, survivor Marilyn Moore gave police one of the clearest descriptions yet. She described a dark-haired man with a Yorkshire accent. A photo of it was created many years later. Many later remarked how strongly it resembled Peter Sutcliffe. Police interviewed him again, and once again, he slipped through their fingers. By 1978, the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry had become a monster of its own. Thousands of statements, thousands of vehicle checks, thousands of index cards stored in overflowing rooms. Detectives were drowning in information. And then, a new development arrived that would derail the investigation for months. A tape recording. A voice claimed to be the killer. "I'm Jack," the man said. He taunted police and mocked the investigation. The sender became known as Wearside Jack. Police began searching for a man with a Wearside accent, but Peter Sutcliffe was from Yorkshire. Instead of drawing attention to him, the hoax pushed investigators in the wrong direction. Part 3. By 1978, the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had become one of the largest police operations Britain had ever seen. Thousands of officers were involved, thousands of statements had been taken, yet the killer was still free, and he was becoming bolder. In January 1978, Yvonne Pearson, a 21-year-old prostitute from Bradford, disappeared. Her body was later found hidden beneath a discarded sofa. She had been repeatedly beaten with a hammer. 10 days later, 18-year-old Helen was attacked in a timber yard in Huddersfield. After striking her multiple times with a hammer, Sutcliffe assaulted her and then stabbed her repeatedly through the heart and lungs. It was the only known rape among his confirmed attacks. Then came May. Vera Millward, a 40-year-old mother of 7, left her flat to buy cigarettes. Instead, she was lured into Sutcliffe's car and murdered with extreme brutality. Her injuries shocked investigators. By now, detectives were convinced they were dealing with a sadistic serial killer. In March 1979, Irish student Anne Rooney was attacked at Horsforth College. She survived, and her description of the attacker was remarkably detailed. Dark hair, a square face. Again, the description pointed towards Peter Sutcliffe. Once again, police failed to connect the dots. On April 4th, 1979, 19-year-old Josephine Whittaker was murdered while walking home across Savile Park Moor in Halifax. She was not a prostitute. The attack was frenzied, involving both a hammer and a screwdriver. 5 months later, university student Barbara Leach was killed in Bradford. Her body was partially covered with carpet and stones. The murder of another young woman with no connection to prostitution caused widespread alarm. The public now understood that any woman could be a target. As fear spread, police received a package that changed the course of the investigation. Inside was a cassette tape. A man's voice spoke directly to Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield. It said, "I'm Jack. I see you're having no luck catching me." The sender mocked the police and claimed responsibility for the murders. Investigators became convinced that the voice belonged to the Yorkshire Ripper. Officers continued to search for a man with a Wearside accent. Peter Sutcliffe, with his unmistakable Yorkshire accent, was pushed further from suspicion. Decades later, DNA would prove that the tape had been sent by a man named John Samuel Humble, an unemployed alcoholic from Sunderland. But in 1976, police treated the tape as genuine. It was one of the most damaging mistakes in British criminal investigation history. While detectives chased a false lead, Sutcliffe continued to kill. He had already been interviewed several times. His car had been seen repeatedly in the red light districts. Survivors had described a man who looked remarkably like him. His name had appeared during the investigation into the traceable £5 note. Yet the focus on the Wearside accent allowed him to remain in the shadows. Women across Yorkshire were warned not to walk alone. Some police officers even suggested that women should stay off streets at night. The response sparked anger amongst feminist groups who organised Reclaim the Night marches and argued that women should not lose their freedom because the killer was at large. As 1979 ended, the investigation was exhausted. Millions of pounds had been spent. Thousands of men had been questioned, and the Yorkshire Ripper was still free. But the next year would bring a series of attacks that would finally push the inquiry towards its conclusion. And, unknowingly, one of Sutcliffe's oldest friends was about to make a report that would change everything. Part 4. By 1980, Britain had been living with the Yorkshire Ripper for nearly 5 years. The investigation had become a national obsession. Police had interviewed thousands of men. Millions of pounds had been spent. And yet, the killer was still free. What detectives didn't know was that they had already spoken to him repeatedly. Peter Sutcliffe had been interviewed 9 times during the investigation, but each time he walked away. On August 20th, 1980, 47-year-old civil servant Marguerite Walls was walking home from work in Pudsey. Sutcliffe attacked her from behind with a hammer, shouting abuse as he struck her. He dragged her body into a secluded garden, strangled her with a rope, and left her partially covered with grass and leaves. A month later, visiting Dr. Padya Bandra was attacked in Leeds. She survived after neighbours heard scraping sounds and alerted the police. Her description of the attacker closely matched Sutcliffe. Again, the opportunity was missed. In October, university art student Maureen Lear was brutally assaulted. Then, on 5th November, 16-year-old Teresa Skies was struck from behind in Huddersfield. Her boyfriend's intervention caused the attacker to flee. Just 12 days later, on 17th November 1980, Sutcliffe claimed his final known victim. Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old University of Leeds student, was returning to her halls of residence in Headingley. Sutcliffe followed her in his car. He passed her, got out, and followed her on foot. Then he struck. When another passerby appeared, Sutcliffe dragged her onto waste ground and continued the attack, stabbing her repeatedly with a screwdriver. Her murder sent shockwaves through the country. A university student in a busy residential area, only yards from where she lived. The public demanded to know how the killer was still free. 8 days later, a man named Trevor Birdsall contacted the police. Birdsall had known Sutcliffe for years. Back in 1969, he had unknowingly driven him away after an attack on a prostitute. Now, he told officers that he believed Peter Sutcliffe could be the Yorkshire Ripper. He even described a violent incident he had witnessed years earlier, but the report was mishandled. During the chaos of the investigation, the paperwork was lost. Another chance slipped away. Then came the night that finally ended the manhunt. On January 2nd, 1981, South Yorkshire police stopped a car in the driveway of a building in Sheffield. Inside were Peter Sutcliffe and a 24-year-old prostitute named Olivia Reevers. The stop had nothing to do with the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. Officers noticed that the car carried false number plates. Sutcliffe was arrested and taken into custody because he matched the physical description of the Yorkshire Ripper. Yorkshire detectives were informed. At first, he denied everything, but Sergeant Robert Ring returned to the arrest scene the following day on a hunch. Hidden behind an oil tank, he found a hammer, a knife, and a length of rope. Sutcliffe had discarded them while pretending that he needed to urinate. Another knife was later found concealed in a police station toilet. When confronted with the evidence, Sutcliffe suddenly changed. Calmly, almost matter-of-factly, he admitted he was the Yorkshire Ripper. Over the next several hours, he described attack after attack. He spoke of an overwhelmingly urge to kill. He claimed that God had instructed him to murder prostitutes. He referred to his victims as filth. Detectives who had spent years hunting the killer would barely believe that the man sitting in front of them had been questioned so many times before. One of the biggest manhunts in British history ended because of a routine traffic stop. Part 5. After nearly 5 years of fear, the man known as the Yorkshire Ripper was finally in custody, but the story was far from over. Britain now faced another disturbing question. Was Peter Sutcliffe a calculating serial killer or a man suffering from a severe mental illness? In May 1981, Sutcliffe appeared in court, charged with 13 murders and multiple attempted murders. The defense team argued that he was not guilty of murder because he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Sutcliffe claimed that while working as a graveyard digger years earlier, he had heard the voice of God speaking to him from a headstone. According to him, the voices ordered him to kill prostitutes. 4 psychiatrists supported the diagnosis. For a moment, it appeared possible that Sutcliffe would be convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, but the trial judge refused to accept the plea without a full jury hearing. The case went ahead, and after 2 weeks of evidence, the jury rejected Sutcliffe's claims. On May 22, 1981, he was found guilty of murder on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life sentences. The judge declared that he was beyond redemption and expressed the hope that he would never be released. Despite the jury's verdict, concerns about Sutcliffe's mental state continued. In 1984, he was transferred from prison to Broadmoor Hospital after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Broadmoor was one of Britain's most secure psychiatric hospitals, reserved for some of the country's most dangerous offenders. There, Sutcliffe would spend decades. He was attacked by other inmates. He lost the sight in one eye after a violent assault, and over the years, doctors repeatedly reassessed his mental condition. In 2010, the High Court imposed a whole life order, ensuring that he would never be released. By 2016, medical tribunals concluded that he no longer required treatment in a psychiatric hospital, and he was transferred back to prison. For many people, the Yorkshire Ripper case became more than one story of a killer. It became a story of institutional failure. Police had interviewed Sutcliffe 9 separate times. Survivors had described him. His car had been identified. His name had appeared during investigations into the traceable £5 note. Yet he remained free. The later Byfield report confirmed serious shortcomings in the investigation. Families of the victims would spend years asking whether some of the murders could have been prevented. On November 13, 2020, Peter Sutcliffe died at the age of 74 after contracting COVID-19 while serving his sentence. For the families of his victims, the death did not erase the trauma. For survivors, the physical and psychological scars remained. And for Britain, the Yorkshire Ripper case remains one of the darkest chapters in modern criminal history. Yorkshire Ripper terrorised northern England for 5 years. 13 women were murdered, 7 others survived, and one of the largest manhunts in British history failed to stop him until a routine traffic stop finally brought the investigation to an end. This has been episode 1 of the Broadmoor Hospital Series. If you have found this documentary informative, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share the video. In the next episode, we'll examine another infamous figure connected to Broadmoor and explore how Britain's most secure psychiatric hospital became home to some of the country's most notorious offenders. Thank you for watching, and as always, we remember the victims first.